So super. Well, welcome everybody. Great to have you here. I'm excited to share about the some things I've learned over the years of how to help partners work together. Now, I anticipate there's probably most of you, one or two reasons that you are here today. It's either that you want to know better how to work with partners and how to bring them together, be more united and make more progress, or you've heard about the open standards for the practice of conservation, and you're interested in learning more about that and maybe how that would apply. Does that cover, who does that cover that you're here for one of those reasons? Raise your hand if that covers some of you. Good. Okay, good. That means you're in the right place. It means I'm in the right place. I prepared the right webinar. So that's great. So the reason I prepared this webinar on the topic of leveraging partnerships using open standards, it's you've probably heard the old adage that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And can we agree? Have you found that that's true about the going far? You need a partner. Um, but the caveat there is sometimes it takes Herculean effort to get that partnership moving so you can go far. Just on a personal note, I come from a family. There's I have 8 siblings, and they're all married and have kids now. But when we just want to have a family reunion or make a plan, that is a serious task to get that group. We're slow as molasses, and everybody's busy, and so to even get started can be a huge task, and to decide where we want to end up, where we want to go, huge task. So, that's the nature of partnerships. And so that's why I want to address is how to get the group started, how to get them rolling and keep that momentum so that we can have that truism, which is that we can go farther together. We can have that happen. So so there's a few things I've learned over time of reasons why it's hard to get partners to work together. And if I asked you, we could come up with probably as many reasons as we have people on the call. One thing though, it could be that partners just simply aren't focused on the same outcomes. That's a real deterrent. If they don't have the same vision, that causes problems. They may have shared values, but their priorities may be very different, and their strategies for reaching that. And so it's important to find it. We can't change people's priorities generally, but we can make sure that we get priorities lined up so that we can see where we are working and how it contributes to the greater good. There may be just uncertainty about whether they want to put the extra time or perceived extra time into a partnership. Is it going to create synergistic results? It could be that no one leads out, either because nobody knows how, or the people who are leading out just don't have a system to keep things rolling and keep things organized. And then it could be that after a lot of excitement, maybe a group comes together and rah, they're excited to get together and work, but then they don't see the results. They don't really see the synergistic outcomes. And if you don't see that you're making more progress than you could alone, it's hard to maintain that motivation. And so I found a way to address some of these issues, and that's what I want to share with you today. But first, I just want to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of my story. If you go back to 2010, I took my first job from out of grad school with the Wildlife Conservation Society. I was here in Idaho. I'm in Idaho in Western United States. I was excited to finally be making more than $16,000 a year to support my wife and 2 kids. She wasn't working. She was a stay-at-home mom. So that was super exciting. And I was the only one in my office from WCS. I was just providing subcontracting support for wildlife work in the area. And I remember so vividly just a couple months after I'd started, I was in this narrow hallway with my contracting supervisor. We were talking about what tasks he had for us. And he said, we need WCS to lead us on creating a conservation management plan for this 900 square mile chunk of ground that we were working on. And that made sense, but for me, I'd never been exposed to the idea of creating a management plan. And so, of course, to stay cool, I said, sure, we can take care of that. And immediately after, I'm on the phone with my WCS folks saying, how in the world do you put together a management plan? I have no idea. There was all these partners. And and so fortunately in WCS, there was an expert trainer in this relatively new um, process called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. His name was Carl Didier. And so he flew out and trained me and my team. And man, I fell in love with this process immediately because I just saw it had the system, it was a system and tools to help me bring these, there were contractors and biologists, bring these people together and create this plan that it made me look like a hero in a way. I didn't know anything really more than my team, but the tools made me look like I knew what I was doing because it's like the checklist. Here's what you do, here's what you do next. Um, and so long story short, I soon after that became trained as a conservation coach and in 20 and then any chance I could I took little jobs or coaching and training opportunities. 2019 I became certified by the Conservation Coaches Network, training the open standards, and I went on my own as a consultant in 2021. So I mean, I'm here to, what I do is I help organizations to create and implement effective strategic plans. That's basically that's the world I live in. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. And so what you can expect today, by the end, in the next 30 minutes, I hope what you walk out of here is a couple things. You have an understanding at a high level of what the open standards is, and what some of the tools are. You should have some ideas about how these tools could help you in your work with partners and to help unify the partnership. And you'll also have some ideas about what some next steps are for you, what you could do next to continue your learning or progressing, or if you want to jump right into using these, provide some opportunities there. Okay, so with that, I am going to looking for who needs to be muted there. Okay. With that, I'm going to open up a presentation here, or I'll share my screen rather, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. Okay. All right, you should be seeing my screen. All right. Um, so talking about leveraging partnerships. So I want to just start with a little success quote. Those who are the exception don't hope for a better year. They install a better operating system. They encode success into their DNA. And that's what I want to present to you here. As we start 2025, here's a better operating system. If you're not already using it, I know some of you are, and I will be inviting you to use it in your work. We already talked about some of the challenges of getting partners to work together, one of which is that there may not be a good system to work in. And when I refer to a system to work in, I'm referring to a system for project planning, management, monitoring, and learning. So that's one reason why the open standards for the practices of conservation was developed. So this framework, which we call, for short, we call it the conservation standards, it's a compilation of best practices, principles, and tools that systemize the planning and maintenance of an evidence-based project. The open standards part implies that they were developed through public collaboration, they're freely available to anyone, and it's not the property of any one organization. The standards part suggests that they represent the best practices in conservation work and that they have a standard lexicon, which is really important if you're working among organizations. These standards, they They cut across multiple disciplines. They're always evolving. Um, and so I like to think of the conservation standards as being analogous to a computer or phone operating system. It's not something extra you do. It's how you get things done. It's the underlying software or for your program or your project. So if you follow it, it allows you, it makes sure you don't miss any of the vital steps, and you have all the important elements there to work together for a strategic plan and to implement that plan. So for example, if you're in a large organization, your accounting department probably uses QuickBooks or something similar. That's their system. Without it, it'd be much more difficult to plan, to communicate, to report, to track key metrics. Their books would be a mess. Probably somebody would go to jail. I mean, there's a reason they use that system. In the conservation world, we need to have the same urgency. It should be as important that we have a system so we can be more efficient and not, well, we probably won't go to jail, but so we can be more efficient. Um, so just in terms of the background, in the late 1900s and early 2000s, a lot of the big conservation organizations, they had begun developing systematic methods for planning, but it was difficult to duplicate them and to learn from these plans because they all had their own language. They didn't speak to each other. So one organization might call something an objective, and another would call it a goal, and yet another would call it a target. So in 2002, the Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP, it was established by a half dozen NGOs who they wanted to bring some uniformity to the various planning processes that they had. And their product, which was produced in 2004, was the first edition of the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, or just Open Standards for short. There have been several iterations since then, and for their last iteration, they changed the shorthand name to Conservation Standards to better communicate the intent of these. And then currently, Conservation Standards 5.0 is in development. I'm on one of the committees that's working on that, and it should be released, I believe, this year. There will certainly be other revisions as well as best practices evolve. So as of now, at the end of last year at least, there are 38 organizations in the Conservation Measures Partnership, and they collaborate to curate the conservation standards and incorporate lessons learned from practitioners around the globe. Now, I know we've got folks from San Diego Zoo here. We got folks from a lot of zoos and aquariums here based on the registration list. A lot of people from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and so you can see you're well represented in the CMP. So over the past couple of decades, the conservation standards, in my opinion, has become the gold standard for conservation planning around the globe. This is a self-curated map that you can find online that has, last I counted, 380 projects from at least 55 different government entities and NGOs in at least 69 countries. These have all reported using the conservation standards for their projects. I'm sure there's many more than that, but gives you an idea of the global reach. In a nutshell, the conservation standards facilitate cooperative adaptive management, meaning it allows project teams to answer three of the basic questions that we all want to know for our project. Are we doing the right things? Are we doing them well? And are we achieving an impact? So if you follow the conservation standards to create your action and implement your action and monitoring plans, you'll have all the necessary elements in place to address these three questions as you go along. And if you find that you're off track, you can quickly pivot and adjust your approach. So that's really good because, as one of the great philosophers of our time put it, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. That was the great Iron Mike Tyson. So I'm sure, there's lots of approaches to adaptive management. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of them. They all share four basic elements: planning, doing, learning, and adjusting. So the conservation standards aligns with these other frameworks, but it adds a share component, the fifth step, emphasizing the need to share what we learn to accelerate conservation success. So sometimes the idea of adaptive management can be confusing. I know I was initially trying to figure it out years ago, but to put it simply, if adaptive management is done correctly, the process really mirrors the scientific method. So when you're doing science, first step is to observe and hypothesize. In adaptive management, it's simply to identify the problem. Very, very similar. Next step is to design an experiment or to design a management plan. Then you execute the experiment or you implement the plan. You gather data or you monitor results. You analyze the data, you evaluate the results, or you revisit hypotheses and adjust and adapt. So if you want to do good science, follow the scientific method. If you want to manage a project that is focused on results and nimble enough to allow you to adapt as new evidence emerges, use a framework that ensures you don't omit any part of the adaptive management process. It's really that simple in my mind. Now, I don't have time to walk us through all 5 steps of the conservation standards. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the first 2, which is probably the most relevant to many of you here. That's the assess and plan steps. These here, they include the framework for creating an action plan with partners and getting ready to implement it. One of my colleagues and I here a few years ago, we created a schematic to help explain the key steps of the action planning, these steps 1 and 2 of the conservation standards. People were getting a little confused when we teach them, so I want to show this to you. So the first major thing you do when you bring a team together is you develop a shared vision of how you want the world to look as a result of your work. Then you identify the core ecological and human values that they must be healthy and functioning. Yeah, they should be functioning well, really, to achieve that vision. Next, you define quantitatively what it means for these elements or targets to be healthy. And you define the current status and the future desired condition. That's called a viability assessment. The next step is to identify the critical threats or pressures that are affecting your focal targets. And once we know what the critical threats are, then we can explore each of them as a team to understand what's driving them and allowing them to persist. This is called a situation analysis. And only after we have a united understanding of the root and nature of the problem do we then start brainstorming strategies for how we might intervene. This is a way to get out to have out-of-the-box thinking about how to solve the problems. There's going to be a lot of ideas when you brainstorm potential strategies, so we have tools to narrow the pool through a prioritization process. So we just select the high leverage strategies to proceed with. Then before we implement a strategy, as a team, we want to pause and consider the inherent assumptions we're making as a team about how we expect our strategies will lead to desired outcomes. And we do this by exploring our theory of change. So because now we have a working hypothesis, that's our theory of change, of how we expect change to occur, we can test our assumptions and we can track our results by identifying relevant goals and objectives. So they're all aligned with what we want to do. And if we go through this loop year after year, re-examining our assumptions and our monitoring results and adapting our approach, which are steps 3 and 4 of the process, over time we'll move closer and closer to this vision that we identified. So the conservation standards, one of the reasons I love them is because they're just based on sound principles of strategic planning. And this because they were built, these universal principles that they're built on, they came from, the CMP just examined, went and looked in the research and the literature for how business and how this is done in the business world, the medical world, education, communities, and so forth. So I'm going to list out on the principles that the conservation standards follows, and then I'll have a little red bar up here. It'll show you where in the process that principle applies. So a good strategic plan clearly describes the destination. Uh, it focuses on just a few key elements and avoids distractions that divert its best interest. It defines what success looks like. It clarifies what the problem is to be solved. There's consistent prioritization and reprioritization. A good action plan tests its assumptions, and it has mechanisms in place so effectiveness of actions and conservation impact can be measured. So the conservation standards codifies these principles, which is why they can be applied broadly to any conservation-related project. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of how a group of partners came together and created an action plan for the Capon watershed in West Virginia. So this is a plan. It was based on the conservation standards, and it's one that I helped to develop in 2023, and I've coached them through the first year of implementation. So this plan, it's been turning a lot of heads in the Chesapeake Bay region. It's been hailed as a blueprint for collaborative planning. So they've done a fantastic job there. So to begin, the partners of this, the Capon Watershed Collaborative or CWC, they met and they clarified their scope. Where would they work? Which in this case was pretty simple. It's within the geographic boundaries of the watershed. But you got to start, you need to know where you're going to work and more importantly, where you're not going to work. Then they created a vision statement that articulated how they want the world to look within this scope as a result of their work. And here's their vision statement. A thriving and connected network of protected and well-managed lands that ensures the Capon watershed's ecological resilience, water quality, economic vitality, and health of its people. So that's where they're going. They have a clear picture. They've worked it out together. This is the end where we want to arrive. The next step was to clarify what the CWC was going to focus on so they could get to that end point, what they needed to conserve to achieve their vision. These are what we call focal targets, which includes ecological values or conservation targets and human well-being values that are important to the project. So to keep things simple, we'll just follow one of these conservation targets. We'll pick forests here. In the next step, the team asks, all right, how healthy are the targets, or in this case, how healthy is the forest target as they described it, and how can we represent that health quantitatively with metrics so we can monitor them and know and demonstrate to our partners and our funders if we're moving the conservation needle. How can we do that? So this was done by conducting a viability assessment and identifying key attributes. So for forests, appropriate age diversity and connectivity are two key attributes. I think they identified four for this target, but these are two key attributes that have to be maintained at some level for the target. The target goes away if these are not viable at some level. And they need to be even higher levels for the team to consider this target of forest, to consider it healthy or in good condition, as we refer to. So the team identified some measurable indicators for each of these key attributes, and then they used them to define as best they could what the difference would be between a key attribute in poor condition all the way up to very good condition. Again, the team's always striving to make these measurable. So in this case, if you were, I won't show you the numbers here, but in this case, the attributes were determined, these particular attributes were determined to be in fair condition. And so the team's going to set their goals are going to be based on moving these key attributes up to good condition. So the next step was to determine what was harming the target. So forest health, it's negatively affected when logging is done inappropriately. Now, to be clear, logging per se isn't a direct threat. It's really it's inadequate forest management that's the problem in this region. So when forests are poorly managed, um, what you have is age diversity. One, the key attribute, age diversity of tree stands, it gets degraded. And so by definition, the target health is lower. That's how a threat affects a target, is by degrading the key attributes of that target. So the team rated this threat along with others they identified and found that this one turned out to be relatively high, a high level threat across the entire project. It affects other targets beyond just the forest. So with that knowledge, and this is now a critical threat, they performed a situation analysis to explore why this threat exists and what's driving it. So experts on the team shared that private landowners often harvest and sell timber without always fully understanding how their decisions could negatively affect the health of the land and their wildlife. And they want to have healthy lands and wildlife. So some of the reasons that landowners do this are that they just may lack experience and information, uh, and they may lack knowledge about to make a decision. And that can be driven in part because they don't always have a forest management plan, or they haven't worked with a qualified forester to produce a holistic plan. So ultimately, many of these people just simply aren't aware of the benefits that would come if they were to create and implement a holistic plan. So with that understanding of the situation, the team then brainstormed what they could do to intervene and to change the situation. And they decided that promoting holistic forest management plans through increased outreach was a good way to address this challenge. And this was end up being one of their prioritized strategies. Now, to get to this point, they had brainstormed a lot of ideas and then rated them to determine which would have the greatest impact and be most feasible. The team then thought deeply about the assumptions that they were making about how a strategy to increase outreach, once it's implemented, how it would lead to improved forests. You know, performing outreach, it's a great example. Education or outreach is a common strategy with projects. And they're fine ideas, but what are the actual results that have to happen to change the situation and the human behavior enough that forest management actually gets changed and that forest health improves? So this was critical for the team to think about before implementation. And I'll just show you, this is the theory of change for this strategy. So the strategy is outreach about forest management plans. You can see these blue boxes are intermediate results, and you can read this from left to right like if-then statements. So if we implement, whoop, too far. If we implement this strategy, then landowners will repeatedly be exposed to clear marketing messages. If that happens, then landowners will want to develop a holistic forest management plan for their land. And if that happens, then landowners will proactively initiate the planning process, which will lead to landowners developing a holistic forest management plan. And this threat of inappropriate management will be decreased because there's an increased number of holistically managed forests. And that will result in an improved forest ecosystem. So that is the team's theory of how that particular strategy will improve. Isn't it beautiful how it just creates such transparency? If you bring a team together with this, with some experts, it would not take but a few minutes for them to give a good peer review and say, yes, or this sounds really good, or no, this is BS. There's no way that this is going to happen for this and this reason. So it's a fantastic tool for working with partnerships. All right, so the final step was to figure out how to measure progress. Now, the theory of change here, it outlined the team's hypothesis, so to speak, about how the situation would change. To test this hypothesis, the team then set measurable objectives that were associated with some of these key results. And then a goal at the end, in the far right, there would be a goal associated with the target. And this would enable them. And so you can see these darker blue, this represents, there's an objective here, there's an objective here. And so those are going to be smart objectives, specific, measurable, time-bound benchmarks of what you'd have to measure to demonstrate that this result happened. Same with here. And so you can create these along your line so that this is how you can monitor if you're making progress. And you can also, it's a good way to show that what you did actually produce the results that you had predicted. And so you can, like, for example, this objective is going to be landowners develop holistic plans. Well, they're going to monitor how many holistic plans are made because that's how they're going to demonstrate. And there's going to be a certain number that they're aiming for. All right, so that takes us through the primary steps of the action planning process, which, as a reminder, are steps 1 and 2 of the Conservation Standards Adaptive Management Framework. So as a team works through the action planning process, they need to keep in mind that climate change may add a lot of uncertainty that could dramatically affect the results of the work. So the Conservation Standards has dealt with this. There's a lot of good tools and a set of best practices for dealing with climate change. I'm not going to show you here, but they are there. It's an active part of discussion in the community. So just to give you a step back, this is a high-level overview of the action plan, the CWC action plan. You can see that they've got a vision statement. There's 3 targets. These all must be healthy and functioning well if they hope to achieve their vision. That's what the team has declared, basically. They've identified a handful of high priority threats, things that threaten to degrade these targets. And then these yellow hexagons there's 5 strategies that they identified that will either address directly the threat and reduce those threats, or perhaps just restore the targets. They're looking to a direct restoration type of a strategy. And that's, in a nutshell, their plan. There's of course the theories of change and such, but that's it. So back to the original question that we started this on, how can the conservation standards help your process, your partnership? I want you to just pay attention as we've gone through. Let me just summarize these steps and point out how this does it. So the conservation standards is a systematic process that helps you create a unified vision. You have to agree on where you're going to go, or the partnership can never work. You need to agree on what the few things are you need to focus, that need to be focused on. There's lots of places you can do, but lack of focus kills progress. You need to upfront define what success looks like. How are we going to know when we've arrived? And there's several ways to do this, but how do we know when the targets are actually healthy? How are we going to quantify that? There's lots of threats. Often partners are working on their own pet threat, so to speak, the things that they think are most important. If you come together, use a system to prioritize those threats, then it's easier to agree on, yes, this affects the system the most. We need to put our most energy there. As if you do a situation analysis together, you can come to a common understanding of what's really driving the threat. And this is going to open up, create synergies and creative out-of-the-box thinking about how to address it. You're going to identify, brainstorm strategies together and prioritize them. And as I said, this may not change what your partners intend to do. They have their own mission, but they can see where they fit in the big plan. And that is so critical for partners to understand where they fit if they understand where they fit and they see it's an exciting, invigorating place that we're all trying to get to, now it creates momentum and unity. And then, having shared theories of change, as I mentioned, boy, this is just such a great tool to have to have everybody put their expertise in and make sure that there's no hidden assumptions that's going to sink the project. You know, we're not going to run off a cliff thinking that we're saving the world. Okay, and then finally, it's going to establish measurable, relevant goals and objectives, and these create a ton of transparency and they create accountability in your partnerships. And I won't get into it here, what you do after you have a plan, but if you're meeting hopefully quarterly, certainly at least annually, it allows partners to come and report what they do, and we can just put them up on the board and see how if we're hitting our benchmarks. So